For my psychology project, I wanted to research whether the employment of defense mechanisms are driven by factors most associated with personality or by the nature of the external situation. I interviewed 5 different subjects, ranging in age as well as gender, as a random sample to test my research question. I asked them to recount stress-inducing situations that would reveal to me which defense mechanism they had used. Each subject was blind to the research question I was ultimately trying to find out. My subjects were ensured that their identities would remain confidential. The subject matter of each conversation ranged from embarrassing to threatening to heart-wrenching. I recorded their responses for later transcription I could reveal to you in this video. Because the subject matter was not my overall goal, I encouraged the subjects to speak freely without interruption. It was my intention to gather enough information so I could categorize which defense mechanism they used within each situation. The questions I asked in follow-up to each subject were intended to only reveal as much information as was needed to accomplish my goal. In my video, I have also developed a matrix in order to show you my findings. I will summarize my discussions and findings at the end and show you the development of the matrix. It is important to remember the goal of this project is to determine whether defense mechanisms are used as a response to the situations the subjects find themselves in and to categorize which might have been employed. It was not intended to judge or resolve any issues raised during these interviews. Subject number 1 is a teenage male. Our first discussion centered around an embarrassing childhood memory he offered to share. Quote, "I was in class and my stomach started to feel upset. I drank some Gatorade and ate some Funyuns thinking that would help. But it only made it worse. I put my head down hoping I would feel better, but I didn't. I ended up throwing up all over the girl in front of me." End quote. When he finished, I asked him to recount what he did in response to the situation. Quote, "I ran out of the room. I asked if he did anything else. He said, I tried not to think about it after that." Based on this interview, I gathered subject number 1 used 2 defense mechanisms, one being regression and the second being repression. If you look at the first table, you will see it represents a matrix displaying subject number 1's 3 different responses categorized under the different defense mechanisms. If you look at the first interview number, you will see the example I have just shared with you. Subject number 2 is a middle-aged male. Our discussion began with a personal family issue my subject decided to share. The subject recounted childhood instances where he was repeatedly bullied by other family members. Quote, "It would bother me. It would be embarrassing at times. I know they loved me, but at the same time they would pick on me. So I would go on and pick on my little cousin. At the time it made me feel better about myself, but in reality, all I was doing was picking on my little cousin." End quote. Based on this interview, I gathered subject number 2 used one main defense mechanism in response to his bullying incident. Subject number 2 clearly showed an example of displacement. The third subject is a teenage female. Quote, "It was my communion and I was in a beautiful yellow dress. I was so excited to say my line, one of the prayers in front of everyone. When I went up, I spoke my line and then I sat down and my friend whispered, 'Do you have your period?' I checked and there it was, all over the seat. I wanted to cry. I ran out of the church straight to the bathroom. I tried to play it off as nonchalant as I could at my first communion. I secretly wanted to disappear. I still try to forget it ever happened, but sometimes it haunts me." End quote. Based on this interview, I gathered subject number 3 used 2 main defense mechanisms. Subject 3 showed examples of regression following repression. Subject number 4 is a 20-year-old male. One of the personal stories he shared was related to a work dispute. Quote, "I parked the truck in a bad spot. It wasn't supposed to be there. The other workers were cutting down a tree, but it didn't end up falling the way it was supposed to. It actually fell on the truck that I parked and crushed it. My boss came and started yelling at everyone, especially me. The whole time I was thinking, it's not my fault. I shouldn't be driving the truck. I don't have enough experience." End quote. Based on this interview, I gathered from subject number 4 that he used one main defense mechanism in response to his stressful story. Subject 4 responded with the defense mechanism of rationalization. Subject 5, which was my last interview, included a teenage female. One of the stories she decided to tell me was about a personal dispute with a team member. "I didn't like a member on my swim team," she said, "and I knew she clearly didn't like me. But it's a team sport, so you have to get along with your teammates. So one day I decided out of nowhere to be really nice to her. Overly nice. It was easier than hating her. She was extremely confused why I was killing her with kindness. In the end, I never actually thought it, but we actually became friends." Based on this interview, I gathered that subject number 5 used 2 defense mechanisms in her response to her sports-related dispute. Subject number 5 responded with the defense mechanism of first projection and then sublimation. In conclusion, I believe that there is little evidence here to support the premise that defense mechanisms are used habitually. Rather, it appears that given mechanisms tend to be used by most people in response to certain situations. Going back to subject number 1, not only do people tend to use favored defense mechanisms habitually, but they also tend to use more than one defense mechanism at a time in response to the same situation. Going back to subject 1, not only do people not tend to use favored defense mechanisms habitually, but they also tend to use more than one defense mechanism at a time in response to the same situation. Defense mechanisms tend to be used as short-term responses, and they are often abandoned over time. I found many of my subjects reference topics which were relatively distant in nature. They often would laugh, which supports the adage that time heals all wounds. Conditions were not ideal. The sample size was not nearly sufficient to make many assertions. The results are anecdotal, and the conclusions that I reach are based on my limited expertise. Also, it is important to note that correlation does not mean causation when viewing the matrix. All these people use defense mechanisms in response to the stress-inducing situations they found themselves in. I would like to take this opportunity to thank my subjects who had volunteered their time to be in this project. Without their stories, this project would not have been possible.